What's very interesting is you'll often hear congratulatory language by both black supremacists and white supremacists about the other, because they both want, you know, a segregated. They don't want segregation. They want separation, and that is something that no civilized person of goodwill in a pluralistic American society should countenance. Both of those kinds of discourse deservedly belong in the dust heap.
Where do you stand on a group like Chabad? I've talked to some professors who have been very critical of groups like that. Do you have a perspective on that?
For what reason are they
In
critical?
terms of bigotry.
How are they bigoted?
Chabad?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with them?
I've run into them. They do a lot. Tell me what.
No, I'm asking. No, this is what I've heard from professors.
But what is it about?
Well, they're Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. Are you familiar with his writings and teachings? I've interviewed a couple scholars who read his text.
I'm not. I mean, I obviously know who Rabbi Schneerson is, but
that their view is that there's a Jewish soul, and then there's everybody else. And I've talked to some people who are troubled by that, some Jewish scholars too. So,
my interactions with folks from Chabad, have if that exists. And look, I'm Reform, and I've dealt with wonderful Chabad rabbis. So if that's the overriding message, it's been lost on me, and it's certainly not been one that's, but look, let me just say this. In any faith, you will find those who will maintain that some kind of exclusivity. So modern Jews like me, I think, can take that not only with a grain of salt, but reject it. I have not heard that. The rabbis that I have met from Chabad have been just incredibly compassionate people.
it gives me a lot.
I just feel badly that, like, no. You can tell I'm a schmoozer from when you walked in the door, right?
So what I want to ask you next, you studied at a Holocaust museum, or the Holocaust museum?
But that was like,
Well, did that inform in any way your anti-hate quest? That's my question, sort of, did that help trigger an interest in all this stuff, or no?
No. And I wouldn't even mention it because the amount of study that I did there compared to, like, a guy like Berenbaum, I was there for, like, on a special program for non-specialists in the Holocaust. So, but what I thought my angle that was productive is that I actually studied it a bit from another angle. I studied from the Holocaust denier angle, because that's in the hate area.
The Holocaust denier, I didn't catch that?
I was published on Holocaust denial, and I did expert work in the case of David Irving, the Holocaust denier from England. So you can see I come from all these areas from a different angle, you know.
What about the Holocaust deniers? I interviewed one professor who said that's straight out hate speech. Is that your opinion? Is that your sense?
No.
Pardon?
No.
Could you elaborate then on your whole take on those guys?
Yeah. Most Holocaust denial is what one would call hate speech. But there are actually a subset of people in there who are just quasi-professional paranoid skeptics. The overwhelming majority are the kinds of folks that we all think they are. You know, Nazi apologists, neo-Nazis, anti-Semites. But there are some people in that mix who are people who have a conspiratorial mindset and a skeptical mindset to begin with. So yes, the overwhelming majority. But when you ask me, is everyone who's a Holocaust denier? No, only 99.9%. Is every Holocaust denier an anti-Semite and Nazi? No, but 99.9% are. But you will find that one grain in there that is like the person who has bizarre theories relating to a variety of things.
I would if I could just quote you. This is something you wrote, and I just like you to elaborate on it. It's interesting. You say, in the white supremacist world, the hate crimes bill is viewed as an attempt by Jews to muzzle criticism of Jews, Israel, and discussion of the Holocaust. These folks believe the Federal Reserve is the way the Jews control the monetary system, banks, and government. Similarly, the Holocaust Museum is considered an example of how Jews have wrested control of the government because it is not a private entity, etc., etc., etc. Could you elaborate on that kind of worldview? Where does that come from?
Yeah. There's a history and a belief system affiliated with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism has roots that extend way back chronologically. Part of this, and we've seen this, for instance, in Europe over the last 1,000 years or more, is a notion that somehow Jews are parasitic on a society, and once they get in there, like a virus, they take over the body politic for their own evil ends. So Jews, if they're a small group of self-serving, crafty people, they create museums and they take over the financial system. They do that, What's interesting is if you look at the Irish, they're about at very similar as far as their immigration history and their achievement. But nobody says, oh, this Irish person who's the president of a bank is part of an Irish conspiracy. That being said, the notion of Jewish control, that's something we've seen in the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. This is just a repetitive falsehood that comes up over and over and over again. And this is just another example. The Federal Reserve, the media, all that kind of stuff. But it provides an easy, if not false, way of scapegoating a feeling for many of loss of control. Government today is so big and has its tentacles in so many things, and the financial system today is so inscrutable, whether it be banking, mortgages, or even health insurance. To the average person, it's inscrutable. So the idea that you can find an identifiable, common evildoer provides those who are scared and who can't get their arms around, these huge institutions and the myriad facts about how things are run with a simple explanation. There's an enemy in charge of this government debt going out of control, or mortgages, or health care, or the media, and it's the Jews.
Could you respond to this? I got this from another website, but I'd just like to get your feedback. The quote that they used is, "Most definitions of hate focus on the ways in which hate mongers see entire groups of people as the other. For example, US-based Tolerance Org argues that, quote, all hate groups have beliefs or practices that attack or malign an entire class of people, typically for their immutable characteristics." So the idea of the other, is that something you buy into? Do you accept this? And could you elaborate pro or con?
Yeah, look, prejudice involves a negative belief system related to a socially identifiable group. And that group is an out-group, not an in-group. In-group provides protection, purity, a consistency of moral standing, and an out-group is an enemy who will use any means to achieve their ends, no matter how immoral it is. Yep.
Okay. The other is what you use that terminology in your own discussions too? Or?
Sure. Yeah. Sure.
Okay. Could you discuss this? You quote this is yours. You touched on it earlier a little bit, I think. Free speech is a right, but bigotry is unacceptable. The issue of free speech, not the Holocaust deniers and stuff.
I think Holocaust deniers should have free speech to deny the Holocaust. My commitment to free speech is sacrosanct. I think the Klan should have the right to march. I think Holocaust deniers should have the right to peddle their horrendous misstatements of history. But when I say bigotry is unacceptable, I'm actually focusing more on society at large and those in a position to respond. The issue is not that there aren't going to be tactical falsehoods or hateful people out there. They should have the complete right to promote whatever ridiculous theories and hatreds they like. My problem is in our lack of response to those misstatements and bigotry. So when I say bigotry is unacceptable, I mean it's unacceptable for the society at large to allow these protected statements to go out unanswered and not refuted. That's what I mean. But I want to be clear. Our center, one of the cornerstones of our center, and you can tell I'm like a unique guy. You know, you're right. You got to apply the standards. A mentor of mine was an African American federal judge, and he knew that not only the morality, but the facts are on the side of the good folks. So the best thing that you can do is have an even playing field where even the haters get to say their piece. My problem isn't with the haters getting to say their piece. My problem is giving them access of distribution that even the most compelling in our society don't get, and the fact that folks in the media or in academia or government don't respond to when these things come up. That's my problem. As Martin Luther King said, it's the silence of those who are good rather than the cacophony of the evil that is the most problematic. Because you're always going to have disaffected, angry people who want to point the finger at somebody else, and that's part of the human condition. But we don't need to give them their own television shows. We don't, we don't need to give them the luxury of not responding to them.
Okay. I've seen this before on the internet. You must have heard this before. There are people who argue, and I think you even mentioned it today already a little bit, that sometimes people are really quick to say racist or hater, and that sometimes these things, even anti-Semitism, sometimes these things can be used as tools to silence. Do you have any sense of that? I think this has come up controversially in the case of Israel in terms of a lot of self-hating Jews, so-called. They have, they're irritated by the terms that.
Do you think we could just shut the screen door? I think it's making a little noise for you. I'm sorry. Didn't mean to interrupt the question. I just. Sorry, I'm making you do all the work here.
Okay.
By the time you get out of here, I'll.
You're good. You're good. I thank you for hanging in there with me.
Hanging in there. I went from my bedroom to my kitchen. I didn't have to drive anywhere. You schlepped all the way from the Midwest. No, it's my place. Please, I'm sorry. The question related to just
the issue of how the term of hate or even anti-Semitism or racism sometimes can be overused, and some people, there are complaints out there that and I've heard this in the Jewish community for those who are critical of Israel. They're caught anti-Semites pretty quickly. And anyway, it's the issue of the overuse of a term where it can start. Jimmy Carter was called an anti-Semite by some in the Jewish community.
He's not.
Okay, well, could you elaborate then on the overuse of things, of whether hate or racist or in our society, they're tools also, as well as the legitimacy of these accusations. Sometimes I put it as a question too. Sometimes are they used to silence dissent?
Yes.
So elaborate.
Look, one of the easiest ways to silence dissent and deliberative discussion is to label somebody a bigot. And it, by the way, it comes from all over the place. I've seen Jews employ it. I've seen Muslims employ it. I've seen Christians employ it. It's a cop-out. Calling Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite strains credulity. Calling him maybe not particularly sympathetic to certain aspects of Israel protection might be legitimate, but the notion of calling Jimmy Carter an anti-Semite, what does it accomplish? If you have a problem with Carter, say, he said this in his book and it's wrong, and this policy puts Israel's existence in a precarious, threatened state, or hit him on the issues. Hit somebody on the, when I say hit, I mean address the issues. But to label someone an anti-Semite when, on what basis? That he's critical of Israel? Doesn't do it for me. I don't think it may be the most sympathetic to Israel, but it's a free country. And I think we do a disservice when we don't engage people. And again, I think if you have a position that you're confident in, you should be able to discuss it fully. But there are people who are anti-Semites who are correctly labeled as anti-Semites, or people who make anti-Semitic statements. Well, let me say, there are certain folks who've made look, not everybody who says something that's anti-Semitic is necessarily an anti-Semite. I wrote a piece about Rick Sanchez. I wrote another piece about Juan Williams. I think we need to have in the society a greater acceptance of uncomfortable dialogue, as long as it's not mean-spirited or threatening. Abdel Malik Ali, he's an anti-Semite. Says that he uses Zionists in place of Jews, says Zionist Jews, says Rupert Murdoch is a Jew when he's Presbyterian, and says that the Shepherd Bird Hate Crime Act is is a plot to stop free speech and how he's going to violate it and all that. I mean, yeah, he's an anti-Semite. Louis Farrakhan, he's an anti-Semite. Jesse Jackson, no. Can people say, why the hell can't we live in a society where good people can say stupid things on occasion and not be pilloried for it? How come Chris Rock can use the N-word with complete license and others can't? I think the correct answer is he shouldn't use the N-word, not that others should. But I do think that we have to let people say, I think Juan Williams and Rick Sanchez are both cases where they can say things about how they feel. And it's not something that I'd want to use as a textbook of what I believe, but I think these uncomfortable and sometimes, remarkably incorrect statements can be a starting point for discussion. Because otherwise what you end up having are people aren't going to talk about important issues. And the stereotypes will just fester because these thoughts aren't addressed. For instance, that's why I think we should be, we should be able to ask questions or throw statements out there. As long as look, Holmes said this: even a dog knows the difference between being stumbled upon and being kicked. And I think that people who in their quest for honesty or dialogue stumble upon stupidity or even bigotry, even their prejudices come out. Good, because you know what? We're all prejudiced. Better to get it out and say, oh my gosh, to come up with the notion that we're going to sanitize discourse as a means of sanitizing society from hate is just absurd.
That's very interesting. The issue of we're all prejudiced. Could you? I think earlier you discussed it's the human condition or something too. Could you address that? I mean, the issue that we're all stuck in this human dilemma of being prejudiced.
We're all prejudiced. You have to accept that. So what? How do you? It's a condition. It's a control. It's, maybe it's a condition like some health condition where you can control it with medication and proper exercise, but it's still there. And how do you control it? You get out of your comfort zone. You're scared of people from Group X? Go meet someone from Group X. Go talk to them. Acknowledge that you feel certain. That's why, this whole Juan Williams thing. Juan Williams wasn't saying that he thought profiling was the thing to do. What he said was he feels uncomfortable in a certain situation when he sees people dressed up in full Muslim garb, for instance. Substitute, say, if you saw people in full Orthodox Jewish garb, you go, okay, that's kind of silly, maybe somewhat understandable on some kind of convoluted level, but let's thrash it out to understand it. But no, we cut off any, and again, the difference between being kicked or stumbled upon. I play for my class the Al Campanis interview from 86 or 87 on Nightline. It was the anniversary, it was in April of that year, the anniversary of, I guess it would be 47, April 87, 40th anniversary of Jackie Robinson breaking the color line. And he made the most incredibly stupid remarks about why there weren't African Americans in management positions. That's exactly the kind of stuff we should be encouraging. I want people's prejudices, their stereotypes, if we can air it in a way that's not hurtful, to let's do it. But you can't. I can in my class, we do it. But you can't engage in that kind of dialogue because we live in a gotcha society. We were more concerned about building people up and then tearing them down, or playing into stereotypes or political correctness, than actually addressing real issues. And what we're doing is, we are now excluding conservatives from the discussion, Christians of good faith and goodwill, because the battle against hate is now being viewed as a partisan endeavor. You know, if you want to read one of the nicest speeches, go read John McCain's concession speech. Beautifully written speech. Look, has he made mistakes, and is, you know, did he vote against the King holiday and all that? Yeah, but I think we need more of even if it's clumsy. Like when this woman said, you know, Obama's a Muslim, and McCain goes, "No, he's not. He's a good family man," or something, to suggest, well, if he were a Muslim, he couldn't be a good family man. Yeah, but at least his intent was good. Yeah, I think we need to have intergroup conflict and the elimination of it be viewed as something that all people on all ends of the political spectrum can do. And I think, you know, Rick Warren is a good example. Someone who's probably, you know, conservative, but who reaches out. And I think we have to embrace those efforts, even if we don't embrace everything about what their interpretations of faith are, for instance. And I think in the battle against prejudice and hate, we have to make everyone feel comfortable, get on board. And I think in some ways academia and the hard left has done a disservice to getting many people on board who otherwise would be valuable assets, if not completely responsive on every single issue. And that's why, like, you know, some of the best audiences I spoke to have been in the Deep South. Could I say what is it? What does a Yankee Jew from New York have in common with you? I said, we're people of goodwill, and even with regard to hate crime, you know, people who think that who think that they would never approve of gay marriage would also say there's no way in their religious construct that they would accept a young man being beaten to death with a baseball bat. Or this is a you know, a universal thing, and that's why I think if you look, hate crime laws are accepted by about 75% of the population, and so, you know, some of when the reasons come out against it, a lot of them are convoluted, false reasons. So I think if we really limit it to again, making the country one in which all people have an equal footing as citizens. That's it. You want to eat a cheeseburger? Fine. You want to go shopping on Sunday? Fine. You don't? Fine. But I think if there's one thing that conservative Christians of goodwill are correct in saying, and that is that their moral messages, which don't necessarily have to come in a theological dressing, can be important for society as well. And I think the hard left, academia, and some of those who want to make the battle against prejudice and hate a partisan or even a, quote, minority thing. There was something up on one of the websites of one of the public California institutions that said, you know, basically religious prejudice could only go against minority faiths, but not the dominant faith. Baloney. Baloney. And I think one of the things that we have to do, if we're going to get credibility, is we have to acknowledge that in many parts of the world, that it's not the script out of the progressives that are merely getting victimized. It's Christians too, and you have to apply it across the board, and that is a Christian church being burnt to the ground in Nigeria or in Egypt is an affront, as is a mosque being targeted by a bomb plot in Michigan, or a synagogue in Sacramento. And I think that we have to make a greater effort to include conservative Christians of goodwill onto this laudable and also very American, very American movement of universal human rights when it comes to faith, and also non-believers as well, and agnostics. That's going to be, by the way, that's going to be the interesting thing, because our center is committed to the protection of agnostics and atheists, even though personally that's not something that I happen to find my cup of tea.
Okay.
You can't run a center. Running a center like you asked about, running a center is kind of like running a restaurant. In other words, you can't only serve the appetizers and entrees you like. You have to serve what serves society, and that's the difference.
You said earlier, very interesting. You've been talking about. You said the fight against hate. Roughly, you said the fight against hate is now viewed as a partisan endeavor. Could you explain or elaborate on what you mean by partisan? By whom? Are you talking about the liberal community or who?
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I think that we have to accept to a certain degree that if you want to get people on board on an overall message, that we're going to agree to disagree on certain things. And I think it is far better to reach out to a conservative Christian of goodwill and say, what can we do to eliminate religious discrimination and hatred and homophobia and the anti-Semitism? What are the areas of agreement that are also Christian principles? And there is not one conservative Christian friend of mine who will say that they think it's appropriate for a gay person to be brutalized. Democracy, otherwise what you're going to have is you're going to be preaching to a choir. If you're going to require a litmus test, then you're in trouble.
So essentially you're saying that for some they view the anti-hate campaign as a liberal bias, right?
I'm sorry,
the anti-hate campaign for many in the conservative realm is a liberal bias, right? Is that what you're saying?
Not only am I saying conservatives think that, I'm saying in many instances the conservatives are right. There was a conservative Christian named Alex Mooney, a state senator in Maryland, who fought to have the homeless added to hate crime laws. And he was disinvited to speak at a school because of his position on educational funding. In other words, drop it. Or that same thing where on a website at one of the public universities here in California that said, shorthand here, the dominant faith cannot be considered discriminating, and they took it off, but one of the keys that led to the success of the civil rights movement was the notion of equal footing. That was what we were fighting for. And particularly with regard to prejudice and violence, I think we need to get as many people in the tent as possible and leave some room for disagreement.
Have you ever had anybody when you lecture stand up and argue with you about a particular, a conservative or something like that?
I get along really well with the conservatives. I have a tougher time with the left than I do with the right.
Could you elaborate? How so? Why? I mean, do you get in controversy sometimes?
Heck yeah! After a gay man was murdered, an acquaintance that I knew, I did a talk about it, and he said, and this was before but he made the notion that I was like kind of a false liberal. I was like, I'm not a liberal. I've been an independent my entire life. I've never registered with a party, never gave a political donation, and never will. I think if you're going to run a center that defines extremism, you really have to try and be as objective as possible. And the other thing is, I try to work with people on both sides of the political spectrum. That being said, there have been folks on the conservative side of the fence who have come up with the most ridiculous arguments against hate crime laws and come up with some of the most anti-Semitic and homophobic and other, but most of them aren't. Most of them aren't, but I'll tell you one thing, that conservatism, if they're going to really reach their calling of limited government, individual responsibility, responsible finance, they better clean up their house with regard to having posters of Obama with a bone through his nose at Tea Party rallies. Because what's going to happen is the worst will end up.
Airheads. That was my.
Well, the producers a lot of times run the. Although I met some really great. Ed Bradley. I remember. Here's what I remember. I remember sitting there going, "I am so glad that I'm not the villain in this story." I remember that. Yeah.
Okay, let me ask you about. You did a whole article on Oliver Stone, his comments, and could you just address him and those comments?
Well, can I look at?
I'm sorry. Yeah. He said, this is what he said. He said, why such a focus on the Holocaust then? The Jewish domination of the media. There's a major lobby in the United States. They are hard workers. They stay on top of every comment. The most powerful lobby in Washington. Israel has effed up United States foreign policy for years. Hitler did far more damage to the Russians than the Jewish people. And so you wrote a whole article about that material right there. Do you recall?
Yes.
Again, I'm asking. I do this all the time. I ask people stuff they wrote 20 years ago.
Well, he apologized for it, so it must have been right, huh? I want to read what
okay.
Yeah, and the funny thing, well, let me just.
Yeah, I don't expect you to remember every doggone thing you ever wrote and every detail.
So you want me to address Oliver Stone's comments?
Yeah.
Well, he apologized for them, so maybe that speaks more than what I could say. Look, it's perfectly fine from a factual standpoint to say that there were millions killed in World War II who were not Jewish. It's also thoroughly acceptable to disagree with the kind of support the United States has given to Israel over the last half century. It's also legitimate to say that there is a lobby in Washington However, you know, my mom always told me, it's not sometimes what you say, but how you say it. And the vitriol and the dismissiveness of the Holocaust in the way he said it, particularly from someone who is such a fan of Hugo Chavez, I think, you know, makes it legitimate that we say, like, look, you know, what are you talking about? Where are you going at by making these points? In other words, if the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission makes a statement about Bernie Madoff that is factually accurate, okay, that's different from a neo-Nazi website making the statement. And it appears to me that he was using these tied together views to really diminish and, in an egregious way, not look at the context of the Holocaust. Yeah, millions of innocent people were killed and murdered in World War II. However, the Russians were being attacked for territorial conquest to affect the balance of power. And that's horrible. And it's something that should obviously be criticized. But when, in many countries, you know, over 90% of Jews were slaughtered, we're now talking about not only a crime against individuals, and even a crime against those countries where those Jews were rounded up, but a war against the very abstract existence of Jewish history, culture, and tradition. So I guess it's like not only maybe it's a difference between, you know, burning a building and burning a museum. Hitler wanted not only to kill any Russian he could get a hold of in order to, you know, to have a global conquest, but in addition, he wanted to kill every Jew, not just in that effort of conquest, but in the desire to rid the world of the culture, history, traditions, and contributions that Jews have made to the world. And you would think that someone who is partly Jewish and has a record of some kind of historical awareness would understand that minimal fact. I think Oliver Stone's a jackass. And I think he served himself well by recognizing that and apologizing for it.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind my honesty there.
Of course not. What about you talk about, and you say in the Christian Science Monitor, they quote you. You say anti-Semitic rhetoric these days is showing up on the left as well as the right. Could you elaborate on that?
Sure.
By the way, are you always quoted correctly? Do you ever get misquoted?
Sure. I'm not saying they got it right. I just don't. Is that something that's challengeable?
No. I'm not asking about that per se. I just wondering if in general you ever get misquoted.
On occasion.
Yeah. Okay, that's it.
Well, sometimes I say stupid things of my own.
Yeah.
If there's one thing that history has shown, is that both sides of the political spectrum will take advantage of anti-Semitism when it serves their ends. When folks are making sometimes very legitimate commentary and criticism of United States policy vis-a-vis Israel, what can occur and does occur on both the right side of the spectrum as well as the left is a notion that there's some kind of Jewish domination or some kind of parasitic Jewish virus on the American body politic. And that's where I think you'll see, anti-Semitism on the left. And also, when you talk about class-based divisions, I think you'll also see on the left the notion sometimes that Jews are responsible for economic crisis or banking crisis or the disproportionate divisions of wealth in the country. So I think oftentimes when you have important issues like international politics or the economy, scapegoating Jews is something that both sides of the political spectrum can do quite blatantly, and sometimes quite stealthily as well. Again, that doesn't mean that these aren't legitimate areas of discussion, but when you have scapegoating and just factual lies, that's problematic.
Ask you, what observations do you have on white supremacists and black supremacists, and what's the common denominator in those kinds of belief systems?
Well, the common denominator in the belief systems is the notion that whites and blacks shouldn't operate on an equal footing in a pluralistic democratic society. However, nobody cares about black supremacists because they don't have any power. Black supremacists, I don't think have controlled the levers of government, politics, the economy, and academia over the last 2 or 3 centuries as white supremacists have. Birth of a Nation was screened at the White House. Harry Truman and Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black, earlier in their careers, as well as Senator Robert Byrd, were members of the Ku Klux Klan. But luckily, they refuted their positions later on. But what's very interesting is you'll often hear congratulatory language by both black supremacists and white supremacists about the other, because they both want a segregated. They don't want segregation. They want separation, and that is something that no civilized person of goodwill in a pluralistic American society should countenance. Both of those kinds of discourse deservedly belong in the dust heap. But there's a commonality of belief. However, there's not a commonality of power. And for white supremacists and white separatists to say this, there's an actual tradition of that having occurred to the detriment not only of African Americans, but our society as a whole. So while the belief systems may be the same, the history and context is obviously quite different, because that never happened on the African American side of the fence, where it has happened on the Anglo side of the fence. So I think maybe if we're particularly responsive in our complete criticism of white supremacy and separatism, is because it's already happened, and to an egregious result. Whereas, the flip side of the coin, while equally disgusting from a moral standpoint, never occurred and never will.
Okay. But both of these groups reject multiculturalism and tolerance and diversity and all that, right? I mean, could you elaborate on that? Is that part of your perspective?
Oh yeah, look, there's a rejection by both black separatists and white separatists of the notion of a diverse, operational, tolerant society. They've written it off, and that's dangerous, because the ethos that I think that most of us have is that one of the blessings of America is that skin color should not be a determinant to one's advancement, nor should it be somehow held as a barometer of one's character. And why, if we do believe that, would we want to separate on a basis that has no relevancy in the advancement of both individuals and our society as a whole? It's a dangerous proposition, irrespective of where it comes from, but because there's an actual implementation and history of it on the Anglo side of the fence, that's probably why we pay more attention to it. But they're both morally anathema and certainly antithetical to what American civilized democracy is all about.
And where does hate come from, in your view? I mean, whether psychological or cultural, whatever. What's yours? Do you have a sense about that?
Well, the research indicates that there are, at least a couple of factors relating to hate. One is individual level prejudice. Someone is, in the way they were raised, or in their experiences, or their personality, scapegoats, distrusts, that's their own personal experiences, had a bad experience with someone from another group, and then makes broad generalizations about that group. But there's also sociocultural things as well. So, the kind of Islamophobia that we're seeing in politics and in part of the media is a group-based element, which can often complement an individual element, but group-based prejudice. Look, if a society has a general bias against a particular group, it is not unusual. In fact, it's likely that many in that society will conform to the norms of that society. That's why racial prejudice was so much more acceptable 100 years ago than it is today. However, people are also affected not only by broad societal trends, influences, and opinions, but also by their own unique interactions, upbringing, and personal belief systems. So that's the difference between both individual level prejudice and group level prejudice, which can often intermesh.
Where do you stand on a group like Chabad? I've talked to some professors who have been very critical of groups like that. Do you have a perspective on that?
For what reason are they
In
critical?
terms of bigotry.
How are they bigoted?
Chabad?
Yeah.
Are you familiar with them?
I've run into them. They do a lot. Tell me what.
No, I'm asking. No, this is what I've heard from professors.
But what is it about?
Well, they're Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. Are you familiar with his writings and teachings? I've interviewed a couple scholars who read his text.
I'm not. I mean, I obviously know who Rabbi Schneerson is, but
that their view is that there's a Jewish soul, and then there's everybody else. And I've talked to some people who are troubled by that, some Jewish scholars too. So,
my interactions with folks from Chabad, have if that exists. And look, I'm Reform, And I've dealt with wonderful Chabad rabbis. So if that's the overriding message, it's been lost on me, and it's certainly not been one that's But look, let me just say this. In any faith, you will find those who will maintain that some kind of exclusivity. So modern Jews like me, I think, can take that not only with a grain of salt, but reject it. I have not heard that. The rabbis that I have met from Chabad have been just incredibly compassionate people. But, let me just say, in other words, this is again the challenge, not only for Jews, but for Christians and Muslims. And that is, and again, I am not a theological scholar in any way. But to the extent that there is a message that interferes with my interpretation of me living a modern life by looking at a hard, rigid, inflexible, and specific meaning out of Scripture that may be thousands of years old, I'm going to err on the side of humanity and common sense. And it is my hope that the rest of the world does that as well.
So, if what I'm telling you is true, if what they told me is true, that in that worldview that Jews have a special soul, and everybody else has a lesser soul, would that fit in your paradigm as bigotry or hate or anything else? Or, I'm interested in your take on that.
Well, if it's true, the only thing that I'm loath here to criticize is I've seen non-religious scholars interpret scriptural analysis in a really convoluted way that's actually not true. Like, for instance, what I've been led to believe is that Jews, for instance, have a special obligation to do good deeds that does not fall necessarily on everyone else, but that all people are regarded as God's children. But if someone were to say that just by virtue of being a Jew, their soul is better, I obviously would reject that. But again, because I'm not coming at this from a theological. I'm an extremism analyst. Not. Believe me, I'm far from a religious scholar in any form. And I've often seen that kind of thing done with criticism done of various faiths. But I do think that many Jews believe that there is a Jewish way of thinking, a Jewish culture, but that could probably be said of a lot of different groups. An Irish Catholic way of looking at something. I guess you could, and again, the notion of making these, a Jewish thought or an Irish Catholic thought, they're heterogeneous groups. Pat Buchanan and Ted Kennedy were both Irish Catholics with different views of what their faith meant to them. But I am always very careful. Let me just, say someone who's not a Judaic scholar. When faiths start to tip towards not only exclusivity, but a lack of tolerance for the humanity of others, then it becomes problematic irrespective of the faith. My only hesitancy is, I go on holidays to Orthodox services, and I've never heard that. I'm Reformed, but I've never heard that. But to the extent that I would hear someone say that, I would say, in my personal interpretation of Judaism, I reject that kind of exclusivity or anything else that leans in that direction. And again, it's part of the challenge of modernity and faith. And I think, and my friend Hussein Ibish said this. You know, there are two parallel tracks of faith that people have. One is the public expression of it, and one is the personal. And for me, my interpretation of faith is uniquely personal, and one that may or may not meet with the approval of everyone who wears a yarmulke. But that's what makes horse racing, and that's going to be a challenge not only for Jews, but for Christians and Muslims as well. And that is, and that's why I always like to step back and say, you know, from again, applying standards across the board, is the challenge today is to take the best of the religious traditions and the religious messages, but incorporate them into societies that are vastly different than the ones that gave genesis to these messages. Religion today is not a law enforcement mechanism. It is not a governmental mechanism, but rather one that should help people be better, not only to people of their own faith, but in the society in which they live. And I am troubled by any overarching exclusivist dogma with faith. But again, I would be worried, you know, about anyone who said, whether it be like there's a special Jewish soul that entitles that person to some kind of exclusive benefit. But there are Christians who say that, you know, I had a Christian colleague at work many years ago say, there's no way I get into heaven because I'm a Jew. You know, so, and I'm sure that there may very well be Muslims who hold similar positions. I think it's important to, and maybe at a technical basis, maybe there is someone or some subset of the Jewish faith that subscribes to that. But how much weight is it given? And what kind of centrality does it have? I haven't heard this. And I haven't heard from, you know, but if I were, I'd say I disagree. Let me give you a short vignette. I used to send my kid to a Jewish school. He's now in public school. And he goes into the head of Judaica, and he says, you know, I question the Jewish faith, and I question God. And, you know, in other faiths, they might say, how could you? Get out of the school. I heard one student of mine say the similar thing happened, and they were, you can't go here. And to his credit, the head of Judaica said, good. Even Mother Teresa questioned her faith at times. I think that is the challenge. And I think thoughtful people of goodwill need to for their own selves determine, when they're reading thousands of pages of scripture, determine what centrality should this have, what weight should it have, what's the context, and what should its place be in a modern society where religion is not serving the place of nationalism or government or tribalism. And again, one of the challenges today is in many parts of the world, governments aren't doing their job. And then religion is taking on a place that puts it in a distinctly different situation than what we have here in the United States, where we do have a separation of church and state on one level, but we also, I think, have, and you can't deny it, the moral input of religion on another level. And the question is, how far and whose morality does it, we all agree violent killing that's not justified to save a life is wrong. But what about dietary restrictions? What about so that's the question. Can we in a modern society determine some universal set of standards that are acceptable not only to all faiths, but to people of no faith as well? And that's a challenge. And I think part of the thing is, I think, as my friend Dr. Ibis said, for part of this, we're going to have to say, you know what, this is uniquely personal and something that I'm going to grapple with, not only whether I observe it, but exactly what it means. And leave the work of governing and the work of intergroup relations to another plane.
A couple more and I'll wind. Mel Gibson. What can you tell me about Mel Gibson? In terms of anti-Semitism or anything else? I don't know if you've written any articles about him, but do you have any observations on him, that as a subject?
Mel Gibson's father made statements about the Holocaust that were objectionable, to say the least. Mel Gibson was influenced by a subset of Christianity which is intolerant towards Jews. Luckily, Pope John Paul II unequivocally rejects the kind of anti-Semitism that existed in the Catholic Church before, and as did Vatican II. Reject that as well. But Mel Gibson's sad comments, frankly, I think possibly reflect on him being a bit of a troubled person as well. I mean, what can you say? I'm someone who always looks at mistakes as a way to gain an opportunity. And it's my hope that Mel Gibson would use his regrettable statements, while drunk, but still, as a way to better himself. But then that's the thing. I'm afraid that sometimes, look, and maybe he's beyond help. Maybe the guy's beyond help. But I'm someone who's a positive person and thinks that in any missed opportunity and any mistake, as long as you have a breath in you, you can make it better. And I think the Judaic tradition is one that almost pathologically wants to understand and embrace those who hate them. But there's a side benefit to that, and it's sometimes you can. Sometimes you by being the best you can be, and sometimes forgiving, you can open people up to things that they wouldn't otherwise be open to. Maybe Gibson's someone whose troubled personal life makes him beyond help in that regard. But that's why I think that we have to set some kind of rule, and maybe Gibson may be very well over that line, but a Rick Sanchez, you know, someone like him should be engaged and probably forgiven.
Helen Thomas, about her.
What about her?
Are you familiar with what
Oh,
she said?
yeah, of course.
What's your perspective on her? I mean, the nature of what she said was a little more, or maybe a lot more intense. I mean, I don't remember exactly what she said, but something like Jews go back to Poland or something.
Right, right.
So what's your take on her? I mean, as far as anti-Semitism and so forth.
Helen Thomas may not be an anti-Semite, but I think if she isn't, she has to get out there and establish that. But, you know, her comments, again, regrettable, hurtful, but I think reflect a view that is often not mentioned publicly. And I think in some ways we have to have a discussion about anti-Semitism, and particularly anti-Semitism in the Arab and Muslim world. You know, I mean, Jews are responsible of putting aphrodisiac in bubble gum to make Egyptian women promiscuous. That was one rumor. They put sharks in the Red Sea. I mean, the notion. Anytime there's an uprising in Arab countries, the Jews are behind it. I do think that both the Arab American community, the Muslim American community, and as well, let me say, you know, the Jewish American community too. I mean, you know, we don't need folks like Pamela Geller. We don't need folks like the deceased Irv Rubin. So, you know, Helen Thomas's statements were obviously ones that she regretted. I think she apologized for them. I think she just recently said she wished she never said them. But I think I would serve a far better place to criticize Jews who make bigoted statements than to criticize non-Jews who make bigoted statements, because I think it carries more weight when I'm seen criticizing everyone across the board for their bigotry. But let me rephrase. I criticize Helen Thomas. She's a schnook. But in the same breath, I also criticize regrettable folks like Pamela Geller and others who look, here's the issue. Is what you're saying constructive? Very simple rule. What Helen Thomas said added nothing to intergroup relations, added nothing to resolving the conflict in the Middle East. It was just angry venting. And unfortunately, we have people like Pamela Geller who do similar things. I think what we have to do again is set a standard where we say there's certain kinds of discourse, you know, if you deny someone dignity or self-determination, that it deserves to be condemned. So in the same breath where I criticize Helen Thomas, I'll criticize Pamela Geller, or you know, I wish there, you know, and I'll tell you something. I like the fact that Hussein Ibish and I will write op-eds criticizing Islamophobia on one hand and anti-Semitism on another. And I think, you know, the notion that you come to me and say, like, well, what do you think of what Mel Gibson said? What do you think about what... Who the heck cares what I think? Look what's happened to them. That speaks volumes more than, you know, than one schnook who runs a center on hate. You know, I have a great respect for the ability of the American public to determine what's the parameters of acceptable behavior in most instances. When I say most instances, when there's an informational vacuum, as there is with regard to Islamophobia, sometimes I get worried. But, you know, if it's something my kid's first grade teacher would condemn, I don't think I need to chime in on it. Whether it be Mel Gibson, Pamela Geller, Helen Thomas, these are statements that are at best unconstructive and at worst a hell of a lot more damaging. And when I hear, particularly with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, people use the conflict and the tragic suffering on both sides as a license for hatred from the comfort of the United States makes it particularly egregious. And that's, you know, when we had a woman who had access to presidents, you know, for the better part of a half century, to make those kinds of insensitive statements on camera, it's strange credulity. But by the same token, I'm in the business where I hear it all every day. And I would say that I'm happy to condemn Helen Thomas, but I also think that it's important to condemn Arabophobia, Islamophobia, with the same breath, because there is a link to Arabophobia and Islamophobia about world domination, domination of financial markets, illegitimacy of the faith, all that kind of stuff. And I think we do a service when we police our own too. So I'm happy to condemn the Mel Gibsons of the world and the Helen Thomas of the world, but I also think it's important, particularly for Jews who have experienced historically so much and are now, in the United States at least, in position of great comfort and security, to say, now that we have this opportunity in the best country in the history of the world, to not squander it, to be the citizens that we always wanted the opportunity to be. And that includes not only criticizing anti-Semites, but criticizing anti-anybody. And I think it starts on our own block. And I think, unfortunately, there's a small subset of people who will revert to bigotry out of fear. But by the same token, I do think that there are some issues with regard to certain segments of the American landscape where anti-Semitism is routinely acceptable. And I think the Pew survey of 2007 of Muslim Americans had some really positive angles to it, but the majority of American Muslims said that they either didn't know that Arabs were involved in the 9/11 attacks or didn't believe it. And I think that we have to make a greater effort, not just to condemn, but to reach out and use the levers and institutions that we have in our democracy to educate people on all sides, whether it be that Islam is not by its very nature a violent faith, which you have upwards of 40-some-odd% oftentimes responding to that, but also that Jews don't run a conspiratorial world either. And I think we have a unique position in the United States where human relations, education, and the media do have the resources to do it. It's just, do we have the motivation, the wherewithal to do it? And that's where it comes in that university presidents should speak out, or we should have documentaries like yours coming out there to lift the myth that fuels anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and also anti-Catholicism and anti-Christian sentiments. So I'm happy to go out and criticize individual bigoted statements from people, but I think it's a more systemic problem, and that if you're a celebrity in the United States, you can say stupid things, and it becomes more of a gotcha thing. What I would love to do is get Helen Thomas or Mel Gibson, if he was up to it, in a discussion and have it televised, and let's get this stuff out there. If it's done in a way of good faith, and you have people on that panel who are truly interfaith experts. I mean, because you have great opportunities. I'm far more interested, rather than destroying Helen Thomas or Mel Gibson, in using these things as teachable moments. And that's where I think the media misses it in the United States. They could use these opportunities to, whether it's Islamophobic statements, to spend a little time to educate people about Islam, or anti-Semitism.
So maybe
I'm sure you are, but you see, this poor guy took a phone call. I'm talking an hour about my, the vagaries of my life, and you're like, oh gosh, I just want to do an interview with this guy, this schnook.
Let me ask you, I'm going to jump ahead here.
Sure.
The realm of, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, but I'd like your take on it. When does criticism of Israel qualify as hate or anti-Semitism? Where there's a lot of discussion about this these days.
But you're criticizing Israel? Get out of my house.
No, I'm asking you.
I'm done. Do you want me to repeat kind of the question that you asked?
Pretty good.
Do you want me to do that? Okay. An interesting issue to look at is, for instance, when does criticism of Israel constitute a legitimate piece of discourse on something of public concern, or when is it just anti-Semitism? And I think we can look at this in an objective way. For instance, can one criticize the Catholic Church for its response to certain things without saying that the Catholic Church itself is illegitimate? I think those criticisms that look at Israel's policies, that look at the actions that the government of Israel takes, are completely legitimate. And indeed, many of the most vigorous critics, Jews themselves. I do think, though, there's an issue when one tries to delegitimize the right of any people to self-determination, and I would include the Palestinians in that as well. So one of the reasons why I think I've lasted so long in this business is you come up with thoughtful, objective standards, and you apply them consistently. And I think in the same way, for instance, one can criticize the Catholic Church's response to some of the scandals that have taken place. And that's legitimate. But I think if someone were to say Catholics are devil worshippers or something like that, obviously that's illegitimate. So when it comes to criticizing the policies of Israel, criticizing the government of Israel, and criticizing what their trajectory is with regard to the peace process, totally legitimate. However, when it's part of an overall contextual diatribe that is meant to delegitimize not only the right of Israel to exist and also the right of Jews to have self-determination, that's where I think that it is illegitimate. By the same token, I think you could apply that standard to other folks as well. And I think that those who criticize, for instance, a Muslim cleric, thoroughly legitimate. Those who say that Islam, by its very nature, is a violent, backward faith or something like that, that clearly is illegitimate. So I think the standard should be is, who's saying it, why are they saying it, and what is the context? And are they making a criticism that a thoughtful person of goodwill could analyze, or is this something that is part of a more nefarious effort to delegitimize the right of a country to exist, and also a religion that is tied into the culture and foundation of that country as well? So in other words, you can criticize the Catholic Church, you can criticize the Irish government, for instance. But when it becomes an effort to delegitimize a people and a faith by its very existence, that's where I think you get into the area of bigotry.
Okay, thank you. What about care, the subject? Could you just fill me in on the whole story? I saw online some tensions between you and them.
There's not really any tension coming from me. I have objective standards. And I think CARE has done some laudable work with regard to prejudice against Muslim Americans. However, if the Tea Party invited speakers who advocated the destruction of the United States government, or who said Jews and the Saudis committed 9/11, or who said the Matthew Shepard James Byrd Hate Crime Act was a plot by Zionists to limit debate on the Holocaust or Israel, I think that the media would go after them like crazy. And I think that when one promotes themselves as an advocacy group, if they're going to invite people like William Baker, who's a Nazi, or Abdel Malik Ali, who says that the United States government should be destroyed and replaced with a theocracy, and who says that the Shepard-Byrd Hate Crime Act is a plot by Zionists to limit free speech, and says that suicide bombings throughout Israel are legitimate, I think that that is something that they need to address, and they need to address it specifically. And I know if I were running an organization and I had that kind of, and there are more speakers as well. There's Yvonne Ridley, who called Zarqawi brother, the Al-Qaeda terrorist, and who said Basayev, the mastermind of the Chechen school massacre, was a good guy. I think that I would have to do more than just a couple of PR talking points. What I mean is, either you stand for something or you don't. And you may be able to pull the wool over the eyes of folks who don't dig a lot. And as someone who has spoken against Islamophobia on different continents, the fact that they define themselves as an advocacy organization should not give them a free pass from inviting people who are anti-American, anti-Christian, or other types of bigots to their functions without repudiating them. You know, if I, with my center, had someone who spoke somewhere and I invited them and someone said, well, what do you think of, you know, I mean, William Baker was a key lieutenant in the outfit that the Holocaust Museum shooter used to be involved with. You know, this is something that is troubling from an elemental standpoint. If you're going to be a civil rights organization, you have to make sure that your shop is clean. Certainly, you know, folks, you know, make mistakes and things like that, but their complete lack of candor in responding to these legitimate, factual criticisms isn't troubling for me. It should be troubling for them. And I think what it does is it encourages the worst of the Islamophobes to create a stereotype about Muslims that frankly isn't true. But I know if I were a Muslim American and I was running an organization, the last folks that I would want to sponsor would be a neo-Nazi who ran for president in the same party as David Duke, or a guy like Abdel Malik Ali, who they co-sponsored a talk for as late as 2007. What I think any responsible commentator would say is they need to repudiate these folks, and they don't. So, you know, this isn't an issue to ask me what I think. Facts are stubborn things. And if you're an organization that invites people who say these kinds of things, either you say that you concur with what their positions are, or you don't. You don't sugarcoat it. You don't say, well, this is like a university and this and that. I have plenty of people who I would invite to speak at the university who I wouldn't agree with, but I'd be the first to repudiate their message. I'd have David Duke come speak, perhaps under certain circumstances. I don't feel any pressing need to do so, but you know, in the abstract, I guess I could as someone who studies hate. But if I were to be so without a list of the million better speakers than him, I would certainly repudiate him. Just as look, I would have Ahmadinejad come to speak at Cal State if he could, but I would repudiate his message, just as the president of Columbia University did. And I think that it is going to be a problem, not for folks like me, but for groups like CARE going forward, if they don't grapple with this in an honest way. And to say that someone who brings up legitimate facts is doing something wrong or trying to point the spotlight somewhere else isn't ultimately going to be helpful, because now people can go on the internet and look at these speakers, look at what they've said, and say, why did CARE invite these folks? And if there is an honest mistake, why haven't they repudiated them? Why wouldn't you repudiate someone like Abdel Malik Ali or William Baker, folks that have been criticized not just by my organization, which is a nonpartisan one, or even the ADL, but folks like the Southern Poverty Law Center have criticized people like William Baker, a neo-Nazi, you know, who's with one of the worst, anti-Semitic outfits of the last half century. It's astounding to me that they get a free pass from the media on this.
And what is the anti-Semitic group? What is it? Did you say that guy? What group was he in?
William Baker was part of Willis Carto's umbrella set of organizations, which includes the Institute for Historical Review, Liberty Lobby, you know, all this umbrella organization by one of the worst anti-Semites of the last half century. And William Baker ran for president on the same party that David Duke ran for president on. And he was invited in the first part of the last decade as their main interfaith guy. You know, I mean, when the Crystal Cathedral found out about it, they fired him.
A segue. What about this local guy, McDonald? Who teaches, there's an article you wrote about him. Could you discuss that?
Professor McDonald has started up a new political organization, but he's perhaps most well known for putting together anti-Semitic theories about how Jews are parasitic on societies and how anti-Semitism is an actual rational response to the behavior of Jews as a group. Needless to say, his scholarship hasn't met with widespread acclaim outside of the neo-Nazi world.
And you had a position about, I thought you wanted the president of that college to come forward and do something?
I think he eventually did, but the point is, look, I want to be very clear here. The First Amendment does and should protect hate speech. That is a bedrock principle. However, that does not relieve the rest of us, particularly those of us in positions of some kind of moral or intellectual station, to call these folks out. And you know, if there's a Flat Earth Society holding a conference at Cal State Long Beach, and it was getting press, perhaps the president of the university would say, you know what, we know the Earth isn't flat. I think there's an obligation for leaders to respond to blatant bigotry and falsehoods, just as the president of Colombia did, Lee Bollinger. You know, he did that. And I think that it is distressing that the bully pulpit is not used by university presidents when their universities are used as a place to legitimize falsehoods and bigoted speech. However, and I said this to Abdel Malik Ali, for instance, when he spoke at UCI, I completely support your right to be here. Absolutely, 100%. And in fact, one of the things I think hobbles those who are involved in efforts against hate are those individuals who maintain that in some way some kind of benevolent censorship is preferable. No. Allow any kind of non-criminal speech, in other words, you're not threatening someone or calling it a bomb scare, and let the marketplace of ideas respond. But democracy is hard work, and we have to make sure that those in a position to respond to this kind of bigotry and falsehood take the opportunity to do so without censoring it.
So in this McDonald's case, what would you advocate be done in his case?
Well, I think similar to what the faculty senate did over there. The president of the university should say, you know what, I run a shop where we respect tenure, and I run a shop where we respect the free marketplace of ideas. However, I find his absurd anti-Semitic theories about how Jews are parasitic on society to be completely anathema with the intellectual goals of our institution, and more importantly, the communal goals of our institution, as laid out in our own university statement. That's what he should do. The guy, should not be harassed. The guy shouldn't necessarily have punitive measures taken against him. But the fact that someone works at a university should not be a cloak or a shield to prevent those who have some kind of moral and intellectual authority from saying they're schnooks and that they're incorrect. You know, we wouldn't have somebody go to campus and say, hey, smoking cigarettes don't cause cancer or the earth's flat. You know, say, yeah, you have a right to say that, but you also have a right to be wrong, and you're wrong.
So what has been the influence of the internet been in spreading hate in the last, 15, 20 years? Any thoughts on that?
I think the internet has served as a social networking mechanism for hate. It relieves people of the necessity of joining an actual physical group that meets in a particular tangible place. What it also does is it serves as a vessel for a whole buffet of belief systems that intertwine. And that's why you'll find people like the Arizona shooter, this guy Jared Loughner, who wasn't even particularly ideological, but he could take bits and pieces. And then you'll find other folks who are more ideological, like the shooter in Pittsburgh, Popolowski, who killed 3 police officers, who actually, was a Nazi. So what it does, it creates a buffet of both the highest intellectual rigor and the lowest common denominator, all on the same table.
Okay. Could you elaborate on this? You said this: our center only becomes concerned when people use their legitimate debates to promote violence. That's clear. And tactical falsehoods and an attack on the pluralistic institutions of our democracy. The violence is as clear as a bell. The other ones are, could you elaborate on your thoughts on tactical falsehoods as hate and attacks on pluralistic institutions? Am I making myself clear?
Sure. Tactical falsehoods are purposeful misstatements of fact that are used in a nefarious manner. So, for instance, someone says African Americans' brain structure is such that they're intellectually inferior. That's a tactical falsehood. There's no legitimate basis for that. Or, oh gosh, you can come up with a million of them. So that's the purposeful use of misstatements of fact to promote bigotry, extremism, or violence.
Okay, that's hate.